Hello, everybody. I see that it is 1 o'clock Central European time. So welcome to the European Marine Board Third Thursday Science Webinar for today. I'm your moderator. My name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the European Marine Board. And if you want to follow us on the social media, you can see the hashtags down there. Okay, so just a few housekeeping rules. Please make sure that your name is clearly entered so that when you ask a question, I can repeat that to our speaker. If you if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And it would be nice to know where you're from, which country and organization. And I will then ask the questions out verbally to the speaker. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat function and hopefully somebody from the team who's there will be able to help you. The webinar is being recorded and it is available being live streamed on YouTube. It will be made available for afterwards on our website as well. So the focus of today's science webinar is on multidisciplinary understandings of indeterminacy, uncertainty and risk. That's quite an interesting discussion, and it is part of it's flowing out of our Embracing the Ocean Artist in Residence program, because our speaker, Dr. Chris Fremantle, is on our Embracing the Ocean committee. So he's a member of the Embracing the Ocean committee, and he is a lecturer at Gray's School of Art at Robert Gordon University in Scotland. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Chris I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to ask Chris to start sharing his screen and take it away. Thanks, Chris.
Hi, thanks very much for that very kind introduction. So my name's Chris Fremantle. I'm a lecturer and a research fellow at Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share share this work. And so I've got a bit of a presentation which I'm going to use, which includes some of the sort of more practical information. I apologize. I'm not a graphic designer, so it's a very basic presentation, even though I work in an art school. I also apologize because actually the work that this is based on comes out of focus on forestry and afforestation. So I hope it'll all but I think it'll be useful. So I work as a practice-led researcher in art, and I also work as a producer for artists work in public places. It's worth saying, I think, that practice-led research has a couple of modalities. What you might broadly call action research in a sense, live project work and reflection, and then reflection on exemplary practices. And so the live work can lead to focusing on particular issues. And so this research comes out of my role as co-investigator on one of the Future of UK Treescapes projects. So the arts work package involves two of us, and between us, we're using both of the modes of practice-led research. My colleague, Professor Dee Hedden, who is Professor of Theatre Studies at Glasgow University, is developing a piece of theatre as part of the project, and I'm leading on a set of case studies focused by exemplary artist projects working with trees. So my project, my strand of work involves a lot of desk research and some live events, live reflective events, bringing together people to discuss projects ranging from those of you who might know Joseph Boyce' 7,000 Oaks in Castle, or in Scotland, there are various projects where artists have been involved in or led on tree planting in various configurations. And so we're reflecting on those. Dee Hedden's work is actually in collaboration with another work package, which is focused by the social sciences. So there will be a set of interviews with people who are involved in decision-making around tree planting, and there will be two outputs. There will be a social science report, and there will be a piece of verbatim theater which represents people's words back as a piece of theater. And as a different way of knowing and understanding the way thinking about decision making in landscapes. So that will be a new piece of theater, which is also a contribution to knowledge in terms of the way it helps us understand decision making. Our common concern in developing the work package was, in the first place, whether artists' ways of working with indeterminacy and uncertainty could contribute usefully to interdisciplinary environmental research. So our fundamental question in the work package is, how do artists work with indeterminacy and uncertainty? And is that does that bring anything to the wider agenda? We've developed the research I'm reporting on today in order to more fully understand the context in which our specific work package outputs sit. So, at the instigation of another co-investigator on the project who'll come up again, David Edwards of Forest Research, over the winter of 21-22, in the middle of lockdown, two research projects came together. They're both focused on the issue of landscape decision making. One on adaptation and genetics, the other one more generally on the role of the arts in landscape decision making. And we organized a series of seminars focused on the question of indeterminacy and uncertainty. There were three discussions involving a group of about 15 people in total. The steering group put out a call across the two projects, and we had for presentations, and we had 12 proposals. This is the full list of contributors, including their sort of disciplinary expertise as well as their organizational context. The call framed the issue as follows: we wish to explore the values, meanings, and ways of working with indeterminacy and uncertainty that a range of disciplines can bring or offer to discussions about landscape decision-making. Where landscapes are often planned and managed to create specific results in, for example, economic production, biodiversity, or visual qualities, art practices often instigate processes with flexible and sometimes unclear boundaries and outcomes that may be ambiguous or open to widely differing interpretations. Is it possible to integrate learning from what seem to be very different epistemological positions? So that was the sort of core question that we asked. And as I say, we had 12 proposals at that point. We intentionally maintained and have continued to maintain the terminology of multidisciplinary because the theorist of disciplinarity, Bazarab Niculescu, uses the term specifically. So he says multidisciplinarity involves studying a research topic in not just one discipline, but in several at the same time. And we did not at this stage set out to transfer methods from one discipline to another. That would be Niculescu's definition of interdisciplinarity. Our aim was very firmly to scope out the range of understandings of uncertainty and indeterminacy with the intention of generating greater mutual understanding across those involved in landscape and environment research. This has particular relevance to decision-making, as indeterminacy and uncertainty are increasingly being cited as key factors in global environment challenges. One might venture that, broadly speaking, uncertainty and indeterminacy are hindrances to decision-making. Realistically, we all experience that in our day-to-day lives. And actually, in our day-to-day lives, we're very clear that we want health services to have treatment pathways and to have drilled down on uncertainty and indeterminacy extremely clearly, for instance. And we've seen the challenges that uncertainty and indeterminacy present to us as a population. So we need to be very clear about the limits and not being and the real focus and purpose of this discussion. So we did initiate this series of discussions from a broad perspective that most of the natural and social scientists use methods to reduce uncertainty and indeterminacy, whilst in the arts and perhaps in the humanities too, there's an interest in using and working with these dynamics or states. I think it's pretty safe to say that there's broad agreement in terms of basic definitions and meanings. Uncertainty is usually used to refer to a state or condition of knowledge. It's epistemic. People often fall back on the known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, made infamous by Donald Rumsfeld. And sometimes they add the unknown knowns as well. Indeterminacy refers to randomness and intrinsic variation, sometimes called aleatory. And another word that was clarified in the process was risk. Things we understand enough about where we understand enough about the likelihood and consequence in order to be able to put in place forms of management, whether that's financial management or health and safety. And it's you know, the key thing about risk is this point about understanding enough about likelihood and consequence, and we'll come back to that. So I need to be clear here. I'm reporting on the inputs of something like 10 different disciplines, and I'm not an expert really in any of them, in the sense that even some of the arts practices that I'm reporting on are things which are different from the area of arts practice I'm involved in. So you bear with me. So self-evidently, multiple forms of indeterminacy and uncertainty were reported, and I'm going to take you through each of those different aspects and the key different approaches, and then highlight points that have emerged. So I'm going to start with Stephen Cavers, who's a population ecologist working on trees. He focused on uncertainties associated with estimation and sampling, such as in population genetics, where trials and field studies involve relatively small numbers of trees, and DNA study is focused on very small parts of the code of the trees. Attention to indeterminacy and uncertainty is focused on processes of estimation and sampling, but there is a recognition that different approaches will also produce different results. Another related area of indeterminacy and uncertainty is in the modeling, which works with the results of the lab and the fieldwork. Here, the key issues raised by Glenn Marion, who's an ecological modeler, is which factors to include in the models and how to account for what we don't know. So, for instance, he highlighted that models are good at revealing that there are tipping points, but poor at identifying the thresholds of them. He also highlighted the ethical dimension of what even a small statistical uncertainty is when translated into an individual's life. So I appreciate that I'm referencing work with trees, and I'm hoping that there are clear parallels with marine-based work. And I'm sure that we can get into that in the discussion in a little while. So the challenges associated with modeling were further drawn out by Louise Barwell, who's another ecological modeler and entomologist, talking about the point of effective intervention in relation to pests and diseases. there is an increasing incidence of pests and diseases directly related to increasing global temperatures. And there's a known correlation. The point where intervention is low cost and effective is also the point where there's low levels of information. By the time we understand and are able to model the problem effectively, it's expensive and difficult to tackle. The problem of modeling in relation to landscape restoration was also highlighted by the ecologist at Harvard Forest, Aaron Ellison. He drew attention to the often static states to which we aim to restore landscapes. He also drew attention to the role of the arts in imagining landscapes in certain states. This is true. This is true in the US context with Thomas Cole's paintings of New England, as much as it's true in the UK with characterizations of the Lake Districts by the Romantics, and perhaps another equivalent is the German Romantics imaginary of landscapes. Here, an example, Friedrich's chalk cliffs on the Rügen. Ellison also addressed the challenges of models. So there's something really interesting about and in a way problematic that art actually in this case is fixing ideas of and making not mobile ideas of landscape. And I think it's an important point to bear in mind. He also addressed the challenges of models in relation to landscape decision-making, particularly the number of variables that need to be taken into account. I mean, this comes back to Marion's point about what do you include in a model and what don't you include. He raised one of the key threads running through the discussion, which had also been referenced by Barwell, the entomologist, the question of whether no intervention is better than an insufficiently informed intervention. Should we do nothing and let natural regeneration be the primary approach to restoration? The evolution of thinking about land management was further explored by David Edwards, who I'd mentioned earlier, who is a social scientist in forest research in the UK. He's the impact coordination, he's the impact coordination manager, as well as a researcher. He focused on different headline objectives for forest management in response to risk and uncertainty over the second half of the 20th century. So he gave us a sort of historical perspective, highlighting correlations with the conceptual developments in the ecological sciences. So he gave us a trajectory which moves from the post-World War II period characterized by economic production into a period starting in the 70s where diversification and multifunctionality were increasingly prioritized, with stability as the organizing principle, into the current period where adaptation and the emergence of adaptive management approaches are gaining currency. The issue of how research results are translated into policy was touched on by Cavers in the first instance, and was then addressed by Joan Cottrell, an ecological geneticist at Forest Research. She focused on the needs of policymakers and land managers for certainty in relation to advice. These connections prompted the introduction of the final session and the invitation to a lawyer and an economist to address the issue of indeterminacy and uncertainty in their domains, closely related as they are to policymaking and land management. So broadly speaking, the first two sessions had contributions which were from natural and social scientists and artists, and they kind of threw up this, or they generated this question. So what does uncertainty and indeterminacy mean for lawyers and economists if they are the people who end up as it were the translators or the interpreters or the users of the primary research, what are their forms of uncertainty and indeterminacy? But before turning to those contributions, I'm going to highlight the contributions which focused on futures, how uncertainty and indeterminacy relate to questions of futures. This was the specific concern of two presentations, although obviously relevant to most. Sietske Wienman and Seth Oliver, who did a joint presentation. Sietske Wienman is an anthropologist, Seth Oliver works in the arts. Sietske Wienman's presentation focused on understandings of futures as articulated in newspaper articles. She highlighted that dominant descriptions of futures are near-term and plausible. Sorry, my thing has just jumped momentarily. She highlighted that dominant descriptions of futures in the press are near-term and plausible, imagined in economic and technical terms, and that the characterizations of desirable environmental futures tend to be placed further in the future, more remotely. Another joint presentation, this time between Petra Tilska-Klashoven and Wallace Heim, focused on the future. Petra Tilska is an anthropologist. Wallace Heim is a philosopher and artist. They focused on issues associated with indeterminacy and uncertainty over very long time spans. In the case they had worked on together, this concerned nuclear decommissioning in Cumbria. And they focused on the in a sense, the constant breakdown of certainty and planning in dealing with nuclear decommissioning, and how that actually uncertainty and indeterminacy were givens and irreducible, and how this opened up a different imaginative space. Tim Collins, so I'm not turning to more of the artist presentations. Tim Collins, who was speaking for the Collins and Goto studio, took as a focus how to think about determinacy and indeterminacy in relation to the large-scale, long-term peat extraction for industrial energy production that has characterized the landscape of the Midlands of Ireland. And they were asking whether more determinate articulations of the concept of ecocide, either with broad definitions encompassing all industrial change, or with narrow ones focused by disruption of peaceful enjoyment of environments, are more useful than indeterminate articulations from philosophy, such as periods of intense techno-scientific transformation. The latter is offered by the philosopher Felix Guattari. The former, the broad definition encompassing all industrial change is offered by one NGO, and the narrower one focused by disruption of peaceful environments, disruption of peaceful enjoyment of environments, as far as I remember, comes out of the work led by Polly Higgins, which was generating a definitional approach. So the question they're asking is a kind of ontological question. Is it more useful to create conditions of accountability or conditions for the evolution of consciousness? So this was quite a different approach to the question. Another approach, again, coming at this question from a really quite a different angle, was raised by my colleague at Gray's School of Art, anthropologist and artist Jen Clark, who asked whether it's possible to imagine a third position. Taking control as a spectrum, are there other ways if control is a spectrum between control and not control, is there a way to position yourself out off that spectrum, or turn it into a field rather than a spectrum? So she drew on French sociologist Michel Serres and others' conceptualization of the idea of parasite. That provides one conventional meaning: the organism that eats at another's table. And the other one, there's another definition which builds on the idea of noise, which is another meaning of the word parasite in the French language. But all of this is kind of asking whether we need alternative positions which are not focused by control or relinquishing control. Another approach in the arts was offered by Professor Emeritus Anne Douglas, drawing on the works and writings of composer and visual artist John Cage, who will probably be known to you for the work 4 minutes 33, the silent piece. Cage experimented extensively across his career, and his earlier experiments involved multiple indeterminate elements. Some of you may be aware that he would rig up pianos with lots of different things hanging on strings or attached to keys, and so he would create sort of multiple dimensions of indeterminacy. But actually, through his career, he rejected this, and he developed an approach where he described the elements of music as structure, 4 elements of music: structure, the division of the whole into parts; method, the point-to-point procedure; materials, the sound and silences through timbre and amplitude; and form, the morphology of the continuity. And he then introduced indeterminacy, randomness, or natural variation into one of these dimensions. And Douglas points out that this is actually consistent with in a way, music and earlier composition, where composer-performer relations, where scores provide structure, method, and form, but can leave materials to the performer's judgment. And in a way, Cage takes this very particularly and kind of goes, actually, there are things that we need, there are things that we want to or can control, and things that we can leave indeterminate. And the important thing is the choices that we make about that. And so not everything is indeterminate, left to chance, but not everything is controlled. I'll come back now to the contributions from economics and law briefly before highlighting some observations. We invited these contributions because they might be understood as interface disciplines, being asked to translate knowledge from social sciences, natural and social sciences, into potential policy. The relationship between law and uncertainty can be understood in terms of those areas addressed through bright line rules, and those areas addressed where judgment is used in specific circumstances. So Malcolm Coombe, who's part of the law faculty at Strathclyde University, highlighted how these vary in different jurisdictions, particularly in relation to land ownership, but also as policymakers introduce new factors. Coombe specifically highlighted the increasing connection in Scotland between land reform and sustainable development. I suppose his point was really simple. There's some things we just decide, like we're all going to drive on the left or on the right, and those are bright line rules. But actually, there are other things which are absolutely intentionally left to judgment. And in Scotland, that includes, given the right to roam, the boundary round a property is not defined. In England, the boundary round a property in the areas where there is right to roam is defined as 20 meters. There's a rule. It's specific. In Scotland, it's a judgment, and the judgment is made on the basis of the property and the context. turning to the economics, Vadim Sarayev, who's an economist with Forest Research, contextualized the importance of uncertainty as a consideration in economics and drew attention to the direct correlation between uncertainty and the option value of waiting, effectively encouraging people to defer a range of decisions, investment, hiring, etc. And it's worth saying, that thing about the option value waiting, those of you who saw what happened when Liz Truss, our very, very short-term prime minister, put out a budget without any evidence to support it, we instantly saw the effect of uncertainty and the option value of waiting. But Sarayev also highlighted that risk is how we understand where likelihood and impact are both well understood and where management can be put in place to mitigate the consequences. So he gave us this from that he is in a paper by Beach, and is a very useful sense of the uncertainties and indeterminacies exist in a field, and there's a constant process of trying to move towards being able to describe them as risks. I want to now move on to highlight some of our findings, as it were. There are several groups of concerns articulated across the presentations. The field and lab scientists and the ecological modelers address the issue of sampling estimation in field and lab work and the challenges in modeling with this data, including the relationship between knowledge and action. And in a sense, that knowledge and action being about what you decide to include from all the knowledge that's available, as well as the limits to that knowledge. Ellison further developed the challenge of modeling in terms of the objectives in landscape restoration, and Edwards provided us with a sort of framework of thinking about the history of the historical changes in objectives. Cottrell put the problem of expectations of certainty from decision makers in focus, and a significant recurrent question focused on whether more consideration should be given to the do-nothing option. Wienman, Clashoven, Heim focused on futures, discussing constructions in the media and the consequences of addressing futures in contexts where uncertainty and indeterminacy are dominant. Several of the artists focus on forms of experience and approaches to indeterminacy and uncertainty. The diversity of approaches offered by the artist contributors might be ascribed to the value placed on offering a distinctive perspective in the arts. So it was, in a way, and you'll maybe have picked up on this, that actually the disciplines had pretty consistent approaches, reported pretty consistent approaches. The science and social science, the natural and social science disciplines reported pretty consistent approaches to uncertainty and indeterminacy. And when I went on to the artists, I had to draw several different trajectories, focused in several different ways. And I think that's because actually the arts specifically value developing distinctive approaches. So Collins approached the issue by juxtaposing more determinate constructions of ecocide with more open articulations, asking which served the context better. Oliver highlighted the value of attention to natural variation and randomness as a valuable experience. Clark offered different approaches seeking to find a position distinct from the spectrum of controlled, uncontrolled, drawing on the meanings of the term parasite. Douglas also sought to question the spectrum of control, suggesting that an approach might be in terms of identifying critical aspects and deciding on which to control and which to leave to chance. this could be related to how in law there are bright line rules and areas which are only ever decided on a case-by-case basis. Different positions were articulated in relation to risk. Some practices focused on understanding uncertainties and indeterminacy sufficiently to assess likelihood and consequence. Others took a position that valued different ways and to different extents the unmanagedness of uncertainty and indeterminacy. And I think that in a sense, the artist's perspective might be understood that actually the only way to the novelty, indeterminacy, uncertainty are a requirement for novelty. And that's an interesting point in the context. So what we did note across the presentations was that most primarily address uncertainty, the issue of what we know and what we don't know, with fewer addressing the issue of indeterminacy, randomness, and natural variation. We can identify several distinct areas of concern within the presentations. Concern with knowledge, articulated in terms of estimation and sampling in fieldwork and lab work, in terms of factors to consider in modeling, in terms of conflicting knowledge versus action trajectories in the context of decision-making, risk as a concept which bounds knowledge but leaves some uncertainties as currently out with the scope of management. There's a concern with futures and the issue of near and distant futures, which aspects of futures we're confident to project, economic and technical, and the role of arts in offering images of pasts that are projected onto futures, what happens in the context of durational uncertainties such as nuclear decommissioning. Concern with change and how it relates to uncertainty and indeterminacy. A particular concern of the artists who consistently articulated a need to engage with indeterminacy, whether through experience, noise, parasitism, or selection of a dimension to open to chance operations in order to enable creativity and emergence rather than repetition, but also in historical terms, considering changing priorities or even paradigms. With action, finally, with action and the question of how to act, the apparent alternatives of management and control versus letting nature get on with it, and the nuances that were explored. The law offers an interesting example in terms of bright line rules versus judgments, which might be correlated with Anne Douglas's discussion of John Cage's analysis of aspects of composition and the selection of which to control and which to leave to chance. Thank you very much. I've actually gone on longer than I expected, and I apologize for that. I thought I was going to run short, but I've run long. There's the reality for you. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Chris. That was very interesting. It was very different from our usual webinars. And so I'm sure there are lots of people sort of trying to process what you said. I certainly am trying to process what you said. But while I'll do that, I see we have a question from Martina Gagliotti. Sorry, Martina. And the question is, how would you perform with concern of field encountered stakeholders towards knowledge advancement?
Sorry, can I? How would you?
I can. I will. If you can see the questions, you can read it yourself, which might help. But I'll reread it for you. How would you perform with concern of field encountered stakeholders towards knowledge advancement? I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, so if I understand the question, it's exactly right in a way that actually, if you encounter stakeholders in the field, then actually you encounter them in the context of their lived uncertainties. And so, you know, in a way, one of the other interesting observations that a colleague made is that in a sense, another way to understand the difference between the artists and the scientists' perspectives and I kind of referenced it a little bit, which is the artists move between the ontological and the epistemological and the methodological quite freely, whereas the scientists tend to focus on the epistemological and the methodological. And so this question of dealing with stakeholders in the field, I think is really interesting, because you are dealing with them where they live and where their life is. And in a way, it's also very literally the focus of the reason why, in a sense, we're taking these two approaches to the interview material. That the social scientists, you know, we will do a set of interviews, and the social scientists will take that material and they will do a social science analysis of it, and Dee Hedden will take that material and she will construct a piece of verbatim theatre out of it. Verbatim theatre, there are different ways of doing it. Some of them very literally only use words spoken by individuals verbatim. Others, David Hare, who's one of the primary protagonists or producers of verbatim theatre, actually takes a slightly looser approach and will use stuff that's been taken down in note form. But the point, in a sense, is that we will have two ways of understanding what a bunch of people involved in landscape decision making about trees on the ground have to say, and in a sense we will accept that they're incompatible on one level, because they're generated by two completely different methodologies, one of which is compositional and the other one of which is analytical. If you see what I'm getting at. But on the other hand, I think at the end of it, our level of understanding will be considerably greater, because there's much more likelihood, I hope, that actually that problem of encountering people in the field will stay present in the process, rather than get erased by the process of trying to produce knowledge as generality.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I hope that's some sort of answer to the question.
Yeah, I do not know if that answers the question. Martina, if it answers, she's also written, currently I'm working on with the diving sector, trying to advance the extant teaching materials of the reference teaching agencies, writing a manual based on environmental characteristics of their living space. And it is written with local stakeholder engagement with a bottom-up approach. So that's I think what's answers that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's exactly the problem as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And I mean, you were talking about some of the methodologies that you mentioned, population modeling, dynamics and modeling I could see how it is very similar to what we do in fishery science, or
I hope
the methodologies.
I hope
the
so,
methodologies are nominally quite similar at the base. But one of the things that you mentioned was about how some of the art forms were quite related to some of the legal. I'm just trying to put it in my own words here. Some of the legal procedures, which are sometimes very, very strict and other times more loose. But my impression of the legal systems in general, and I've lived in the UK and in other places, is that they are by and large mostly very strict. And I was wondering whether a lot of the management stuff that comes from natural sciences specifically is specifically because the legal system is very strict. For instance, managing fisheries, they tend to want to know just how much of one species. You only have a legal limit for this species, or how many fish you can catch for this species, regardless of what the impact would be on all the other species around it. And so I was kind of wondering whether the natural sciences have become harder in that sense because of the legal, especially in a management perspective, because of the legal framework that they're trying to appease. So I wonder what you think of that.
So I have only a layman's understanding. I live in Scotland, which has a very big cultural history with fishing, but I have a layperson's understanding of fishing, and very much a landlubber's understanding of fishing. Actually, you know, and I think So I suppose I'm particularly interested in what other disciplines might share actually maybe unexplored sharing of some relationship with art's ways of knowing, and another, and so my go-to normally is surgeons and surgery, because actually there's actually an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise in surgery, but it's enacted on the day and it's taught, you know, but also it's interesting. The value of not knowing in medicine is actually higher than in other areas. I had a very interesting conversation with somebody who said, actually, the very best students can be very dangerous because they actually move to answers too quickly. They know too much stuff, and they diagnose too quickly. And actually, very often, a good diagnosis requires a bit of patience to fully understand what's actually going on. And not to take data and interpret it too quickly. So I find that's really useful, because actually I think artists value not knowing and the state of not knowing for exactly the same reasons, because they've got to work out. The artists, the medics are doing it because they want to make a good, accurate diagnosis on the basis of which to put somebody on a treatment pathway, which is life and death. The artists have a completely, utterly different value for that, which is, I need to find an angle that actually nobody's ever used before. You know, I mean, in the end, an artist has to, you know, you paint a still life, you got to try and find a way to paint a still life that's distinctive from 500 years
other
of
people
life
who've
painting.
done it. Yeah.
So the value of not knowing, you know, the practical implementation of that shared value of not knowing is completely different. But it's interesting that there's the shared value. So the law thing, I think, is of that same sort of categorical question, which is in a sense what practices are able to both adopt strict rules and judgments as part of a I'm going to use the word portfolio, which triggers another thing. But so I suppose my analogy, my reason for suggesting that there might be some connection with the law actually is to do only really probably with the keeping two things in motion at the same time.
Yeah.
The use of hard rules and the use of judgment, and kind of going, you know, how do I use both of these? How do I understand working with both of these things as part of my milieu? And so because clearly, as you say, the you know, one of the, I mean, it's a brilliant example, the question of, here's fishermen, they fish, the rules are focused on single species, but actually when you put a net in the water, that's, you know, the lived reality and the formation of rules is a particular, I mean, that's a, you know, even as a landlubber layperson in the subject, I'm totally aware of the scale of that problem. And I don't, you know, in a way, I don't, so no, yeah, I hear what you're referring to, and that is, I suppose, a very sharp example of the problem.
Yeah. I will say there was a more of a comment in the questions and answers by Therese Higgins, who says, I don't know if it's she or he, sorry. They're an artist. Yeah, sorry. They're an artist working in Orkney and interested in the issues of the sea flowing around the marine protected areas and the legal discussion about how it isn't affecting the species on the line on either side. And that they're dealing with it at the moment with a huge fish farm being proposed close to the MPA. So also agreeing with this legal is versus physical real life. Yeah, so I think that's quite interesting that it seems like it's quite yeah, it's maybe another way of looking at it. There's also a question from Paula, one of our Marine Board staff that she sent me to say. She's interested to hear about your experience of how different disciplines actually present the concept of risk and indeterminacy. So how is it received and understood by others? You know, in science, when we want to put up an uncertainty, we put an error bar on our graphs or something. How is it done in the arts, and how do people perceive it? And actually following on from that, just to say that there was a PhD student from the University of Norwich, I think, who looked at people's perceptions of uncertainty in climate change predictions. So she projected different types of climate change projections using different methods, scientific methods of doing it. And she also found that students who had just finished their undergraduate degrees or like early masters were quite often quite sure that they were right, even though they were wrong. Whereas people who didn't have as much, you know, scientific knowledge sometimes were better at judging. So you were mentioning that people often perceive. I think the last thing you mentioned was something like that. So I thought I would add that to it. But the question from Paula is, how do other disciplines present their concepts of risk and indeterminacy?
Each discipline presents it through its own conventional methods, and actually the point of the exercise, in many ways, was to actually bring us into proximity with each other's, you know, to try and begin to build that sort of, you know. And so, I mean, I don't think my colleague Dee would be offended if I said, you know, precisely that thing about bars was something that somebody had to explain. You know, she's a professor of theatre studies. It wasn't something that she was familiar with, you know. And actually, it's a very useful, you know, I've never used it, but when it was and to be honest, honestly, I was only a hair's breadth from her position. I think I had a vague idea what they were. It was incredibly useful, and they're a very clear device. You know, it makes complete sense. So in a sense, I think, you know, the truth is each discipline has clear ways of articulating its relationship. A lot of the challenge is about the ignorances and the not knowing and not being able to understand and see the value in each other's disciplines. And you know, I mean, there's a fabulous provocation I came across recently about the challenge, in a way, is that in learning a discipline, we learn an approach to truth, which kind of says our approach to truth is the right one. We buy into our discipline's framework of producing truth, which means that in effect we also buy out of other disciplines' methods, but either through ignorance or through the sort of hierarchy of disciplines. So we buy into and buy out of these things, and actually so I'm not sure. I think it's a fascinating question, which requires a willingness to accept epistemological equivalence, which is a concept that a colleague of mine who's a geographer and led another environment research project came up with, which is actually to kind of go, actually in disciplinary terms, we really, really, really need to get to a point where we accept epistemological equivalence. There are lots of ways of knowing the world, and they are all equally valuable they are all equally valuable in what they set out to do. But actually they're not equivalent in the sense of being compatible necessarily. That was what, one of the difficulties of this piece of work was actually even understanding. I really struggled with my colleagues' presentation on noise and parasites, and I really struggled to understand what she was trying to get across until actually the last time I presented this. The following presentation was from an artist who does a lot of work on salt marsh restoration, and kind of went, actually, I don't tell people I'm an artist. I just take on the role of project manager, and I get on with it, and I get on with the work, and I kind of adopt this sort of practical personality of being project manager. And I kind of went, oh, okay, that's self-evidently, he's not a parasite in the literal sense. He's not, it's a very difficult word, but he is taking himself out of wearing a particular disciplinary hat, and in order to position himself in a space where it's much more useful for people to kind of not know who you are than to know who you are in that sense. And so this, and that's the ontological dimension in a way. He's making an ontological judgment about how it's useful to be in the world, kind of regardless of, and actually he's almost kind of going, actually, yes, I can stand here and go, I'm an artist, I have expertise that's relevant here. And a coastal hydrologist will go, I have expertise that's relevant here. And a cultural historian will go, I have expertise that's relevant here. But actually, in order to be on the ground and think about salt marsh restoration, he's going, actually, the ontological bit is more important than the epistemological bit, actually, in order for me to be able to bring my knowledge to bear in the situation. So I'm going to obfuscate to do that. I'm going to.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It is, and sometimes not putting a little border around yourself helps you to understand each other better, I think. So yeah. Well, that was a very, very interesting. I'm really sorry we don't have time for much more discussion because our hour is up. But thank you very much, Chris. That definitely opened my mind, like a good swim does open your head. So thank you very much.
Yeah. So this should be published in the Journal of Landscape Research sometime later this year as part of a special edition on the role of arts and landscape decision making.
Excellent. Yeah.
And I will happily make sure that I pass that information when it comes out, when I pass it on to Brit in case so people can know where that is and if it's useful. Yeah,
that would be great. Thank you very much. So thank you very much again for the discussion. It was really an excellent discussion. And